Hi, Omid. We're here. Can you hear us? Me and Angela.
All right. Hello. Welcome, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Some folks are already exploring the chat box because they saw my video, saw my voice moving, but they didn't hear audio. But everyone should hear me now. If you haven't already, go to the chat box and just give me a yes or no if you can hear me. I want to do a little technical troubleshooting. Cool. I'm getting all yeses, and people can see me too. Continue the yeses if that's the case. Cool. I'm getting all straight yeses. Straight A's for everyone. Awesome. Well, hello. My name is Omid Bigari. I'm with Just Lead Washington as a Director of Equity Community Partnership. This is our latest REGI webinar, a webinar of the Washington Race Equity and Justice Initiative. I'd like to do a little introductions, just to welcome everyone today, do a little more technical troubleshooting, and then I want to hand it off to our two guests that we're very lucky to have today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves fully. But we have Dr. Michelle Majors and Angela Dunleavy-Stowell to kind of share their experiences on this topic of what we're calling coffee conversations, but really leadership lessons and what leadership challenges look like in advancing any type of work under the bucket of diversity, equity, and inclusion on an organizational level. So Angela's gonna speak to that experience as CEO as Fair Start, an organization here based in Seattle and King County, doing food service and training, job training programs. And Michelle's going to also speak for her work doing equity work and particularly race equity work and everything in between that they'll be able to get to. So a little more technical troubleshooting. Folks have tested out the chat box. Everyone can hear us. If there are any technical issues, please let us know during the webinar in the chat box. Although I'll hand it off to them, I'll be here to support on any questions folks have. Also, if you have questions for Michelle and Angela, check out that Q&A button icon at the top. Please submit your questions. We'll be able to kind of touch on those throughout and certainly at the end as well. And we'll do our best to get to all those questions. So with that said, I'm going to get us set up and hand it over to Michelle and Angela. So folks, give me one moment. Michelle, go ahead and turn on your video. There you are. Awesome. Cool. We can both see you. Make sure your microphone is set up too as well. So far, I'm not hearing your voice.
We're not saying anything yet.
Perfect. Okay. I was like, I thought we did the checks and all that. Perfect. We can hear you. We can see you. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I will hand it off to you, and we'll be here throughout to support y'all too. If there's any technical issues y'all have, just shout out or chat away.
Awesome. And feel free to chime in if there's anything going on, because we can't necessarily see the chat room or all that's going on. So you have carte blanche to stop and interject if there's something that we need to do.
Perfect. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah. So excited. I mean, I'm excited for a couple of reasons to do this coffee chat, and I'm glad it's called a coffee chat, so we can treat it like a coffee chat and not like the consultant, talking about this in a very rigorous way. A lot of the work that we encounter in this work, it really does, it's on a humanistic level, and it's some of the things that we don't always talk about, like, how did you feel about that? And how did you navigate through that? So this really designed to ask some of those questions that just you know, a lot of people have that are not necessarily, well, what book did you read? Or what did you, it was like more of your, what was your experience? And so my name is Michelle Majors. I am the principal of Majors Leadership. And I actually had the privilege to work with Angela in her organization as they kind of went through the process of their DEI journey. I worked with Aline Carton-Lisfield, and we collaborate with a collaboration with Just Lead. So we haven't really got a chance to fully debrief as we said we were going to. I didn't know this debrief would happen in front of people, but I think we'll take it. We'll take it. So I'll have you introduce yourself, and then I will kind of go through kind of the context before I start asking you questions.
Great. So my name is Angela Dunleavy-Stoll. I have been at Fair Start for just over a year. I actually started at Fair Start, I believe, like the week that the contract was signed to work with Just Lead. So I'm so grateful that the folks who were doing the work before I was there selected you, and we started on the journey literally at the same time. But it was really great too, because when I was going through the interview process, this was something that I felt really strongly needed to be worked on at Fair Start, which is an organization that does incredible work working with youth and adults experiencing homelessness and poverty to receive services and job training. But it also has had a reputation of being pretty white. And so, and as a white woman coming into a leadership role, I felt it was really important for me to address some of that.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm glad it all worked out, because you walked into something and we walked in at the same time. So it's actually been, it was a pretty amazing experience. So I look forward to talking about it more. So what I want to do first is kind of give an overview of what we even did when we came in. Let me fix this. I feel like, should we get closer? I don't know. We're just going to leave it. All right. So basically what we did, and you can keep me honest, Alina and I came in and we did just a baseline training for the staff and the board, the same training, so that we kind of had the shared understanding, shared language about some of the DEI principles and concepts, but also to kind of let everybody know what was going to be happening next. After we did that, we did a org-wide assessment. That assessment took place through surveys. We did 5 or maybe 6 sharing circles with different groups and different compositions of groups, so that people could feel safe and feel heard. And then we did one-on-ones. We had drop-in sessions. I mean, the idea was to make it as accessible for everybody, because some people couldn't get to their computer or participate in a sharing circle. So we had different ways for people to share. And then based on the surveys, we kind of categorized things into themes and came up with like 5 kind of core areas of themes. And then we created this DEI group, which was such an amazing experience. I can talk about that a little bit more. But a DEI group, I've never seen, you know, we started out with like 40 people or something like that in the room who were actively wanting to participate in this process, which that's kind of unheard of, but it was amazing. And so we took the whole DEI group, and we broke them into 5 teams, which associated with those categories that came out of the report or out of the survey, so that they can kind of have a concentrated focus on these areas and have like a group that's responsible for fulfilling that. And they came up with these recommendations, and it just so happened that you were doing strategic planning. And so in many of our conversations, you were so intentional and thoughtful about wanting to make sure that all this work they were doing was included in how the strategic plan, and you did an excellent job. And we'll talk about transparency and level setting, but you did a good job of letting people know this may come in 2023. This might be a 2022 initiative, but everything was heard in some way, incorporated into the strategic plan. So you got your strategic plan going, and I still am part of some of the chat groups, and so I see there's still stuff kind of happening.
I think the one thing that I would add that is really unique about Fair Start and the way that we did this is, you know, we had to sort of readjust for the fact that Fair Start isn't just a social service organization with a lot of people behind desks, that we were trying to access people who are working in restaurants and catering, who are training students, and in different physical, not only physical locations, but with different time constraints. So it wasn't as easy, I think, in some ways.
Exactly. But I think what did work about it was people said, hey, I want to participate and I can't. So it was the people that said, how am I going to do this? I'm in a truck all day. When does that happen? So we came with a plan and design of how it could go, but you know, by the time we had to add sharing circles, we had to drop it and we were there all day for people to come in when they could. So I thought that was really a good plan too.
Yeah, great.
So my first question is, is that a question? What has this process been like for you?
It's, you know, it's been a really, at times exhausting and it's like been simultaneously exhausting and energizing journey. And I think it's given me more hope that we are on the right track and real intentionality around what we're doing. And I think that more than anything, it's created a different culture at Fair Start that is really something that I'm excited to lead going forward and to leave as a legacy. And just to be part of, because at the end of it, it's not going to be like Angela Stoll did this. It's going to be like, we all did this incredible thing from the years of 2019 to 2060.
Well, I remember I was at one of the big group sessions, and you know, I was like, for what it's worth, the Fair Start of 2025 thanks you, right? Because we know that this is a ongoing kind of process, right? And so, but you mentioned something that was really good, and it was around culture. I think a lot of times people want to go straight into, well, let's change the practices. Let's change the policies. Those are the easier things to do because they're more structural. Can you speak to your experience in like what it means to make a culture shift and some of the things to think about?
Yeah, I think so. I was in a unique position where I feel really lucky that this happened right at the start of my leadership, because what you do oftentimes when you're a new CEO is you're coming in and you're trying to assess the organization and get to really get a pulse on what's going on. And so not only were we doing employee surveys, but we did this DEI survey at the same time, which opened my eyes to a lot of culture change that really needed to happen. And I think we were in our first big sharing circle. And I think you and Alina and I were like, oh my God, what's going on in this room? Because the number of people who were like this and this it was shocking. It was shocking. And, you know, and I understand that it's really hard, but at the same time, like that was happening in meetings all across the organization that had nothing to do with DEI. And so I think that really for me, what it uncovered was this culture that I think a lot of organizations can fall into, which is this really punitive, like not my fault, your fault, like, or a little bit of gotcha culture. It also was a little bit of fear culture of like, I don't know if I can or should do that because I don't want to get in trouble. And so I think part of the journey was like you have to be honest when you're doing this, and you have to accept the fact. I mean, you should be honest. Must be honest when doing
I'm writing it down because there's a question coming here.
You know, there has to be some honesty that if you're going to actually accomplish it, that might be really uncomfortable, but it also really, I think for the organization was able to kind of crack this, like, oh wait, it's okay to not be perfect every time. And so as you start looking at how to be an anti-racist organization, which we are on the long journey to that, but that's one thing that we had to uncover that we really need to work on is like, no one around here is perfect. This is an imperfect, messy process, and we just need to be part of it. So that was, you know, the culture stuff is sort of work in progress, and it's all a process, but this was definitely a big eye-opening moment for the organization and opportunity.
So I wrote down the word honesty, but that was honesty / transparency. And what I find as leaders, it's just really hard to do that line between I want to be transparent and actually, no, let me be more frank. A lot of people are like, I don't want to be that transparent because when information is power. And for some leaders, it's when I give up so much information, I lose power. And so there's a piece of where does that line between, and also protecting the organization. I mean, we've had conversations where you're like, I just can't say that, Michelle. Like, I'm not going to say that. And I'm like, come on, be vulnerable. Like, I got to protect legally in other ways, right? So what's that balance between what I say radical transparency, where you're willing to share that power and share that information, and the safety of the organization? Because if you tell people too much, it can be overwhelming. So you have to kind of know what.
think that maybe there's a little bit of confusion, or for me, it was not as much transparency, because I'm actually transparent about what I can be transparent about. So like I'm the person who will go into a meeting and say, I will tell you what I know when I can tell you. There are going to be times when it's not appropriate that I dial the entire 265 people organization into the decision, or even, you know, the director or mid-level managers in. So I'm really honest about that. But I think that really what it comes down to is not necessarily transparency as it is an appropriate level of vulnerability. And it was, for me, I think more like, how are we going to be able to go through this process? And you're right, there were some things like that came out in the report that, yes, those were for my eyes only, because like, you know, you hear things that like, oh, this was said, and, you know, it's not going to help. You know, is it going to hurt or help? And I think sometimes you have to go through the pain to get to the other side, but there are some things that are just like, that's not going to help anybody. So so I kind of held those, you know, on myself. But I think it has worked for me so far to be vulnerable in the process, to say things like, I feel really uncomfortable even saying like all the white people. Like, and I'm white, like, and now I like practice it over and over. But I remember the first time I stood up in front of like an all staff, and I was like, so for those of us in the room who are white, and I was like, oh, that feels just, I feel really weird about that. And owning that discomfort, I think, helped everyone go through the process. And I think it's also like the whole notion of the unflappable CEO is sort of, for me anyway, it's disingenuous to who I am.
Can you say more about the unflappable CEO, what that means to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, when we think of CEO, we think of, you know, I'm going to stereotype right now, like tall white dude in a suit who, you know, is really armored up, and, you know, everyone's the yes sir, and I think that, and also the perfect, like if you're the CEO, you are perfect and you never make a mistake. And I think that just teaches people like, oh, if you want to do what that person's doing, if you want to get to that place, you have to not let any vulnerability show. And it is actually, I think, impossible to go through this process, to lead through this.
Vulnerability speaks, just even the executive team feel that they can tap into more of their vulnerability. Have you found the sharing to be different or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really what it took, what it's taken is like, we just need, you know, we need to be able to sit with the discomfort. I'm like, let's all acknowledge the fact that this is going to be messy. And I think that it also, as a leader, letting people experience that, where they're like, ooh, that just felt really hard. What is my boss saying and doing in the corner? And I don't, you know, there were definitely some messy parts of this that we had to go back and clean up, but I didn't feel like I needed to be the one to necessarily go in and clean them up. And I wanted to be a resource to everyone else so that they could make their way through it as well. And so I think that just encouraging that and encouraging others, either my team or their direct reports, to just go with the process was helpful in getting us in the small fraction of where we are in the journey.
Yeah, that go with the process part was really important, because there are times, I think, in everyone's journey, if you're doing this right, I guess, if right is a word to describe any of this work, messy work, there were parts where there's this instinct to, when something happens, to respond to the thing, right? Because people are panicked and there's anxiety, and you're already talking about race, and there's, you know, all these things. And we had to kind of always go back to, but we can't feed into that. We have to like focus on the vision and bring people to the vision instead of bring ourselves to the, you know, the thing. And so really kind of, for me, one of the key lessons is like, we got to do some level setting and to normalize conflict. It's just going to happen. But when you're in it, you just want it to stop, and you want to just fix things. And that's just kind of the instinct to do it. But I think that a lot of people go into this really kind of wanting to get in and out with, you know, with this little damage. I'm like, well, first of all, there's no out. This is going to happen until it's, you know, wherever this utopia is, if there's one.
And I will say, as a solver in my, like, every other part of my life, Like it's actually been kind of freeing to be like, there's no solve.
Right.
You just have to go with it.
I'm free.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is actually a place where I think a lot of leaders would do well to kind of step into I'm already knowing that there's no it's not going to be this bow that happens at the end, right? So I thought that was one thing just in terms of the culture. What kind of resources? I know there are people who are watching who, I think you and I instinctively lean on the more, let's talk about vulnerability and our feelings and those woo-woo things. I mean, that's just kind of where we are. But there are people who are like, well, I want some resources. I want tools and I want rules. Like, give me the thing. What were some of the tools? Where did you go to like learn more?
Yeah. Well, I think, so the great news is that a lot of people are doing this work, however many people are on this podcast or webinar. But so I've found a group of people who are also going through this in their own organizations, and we had some conversations, and so you got a little bit of a sense of what's going well, what's not going well, and it can give some different perspectives on how you want to how I wanted to respond or didn't want to respond. But as far as you gave me some great books. So you want to talk about race was probably my first one, White Fragility. But one of the so I read through this, but I think they're really and I sent this podcast to you. The 1619 podcast has sort of been one of the most impactful learnings for me because, and it's actually informed the way that I am thinking about my own kids' education. Because what I've started doing now is like, I need to re-understand our entire lens of history. I feel like I need to relearn the history of the U.S. through this different lens to really truly understand how we got here today. So that's sort of the place I am in now, is to really understand, redlining in Seattle and the history of native land here, and all of those things I think are really important in frame, like creating a different lens in which you're looking at things. So that's really, I think it's important, and I think it's important to make sure that kids now are learning it in the right way. But I would encourage anyone on this webinar, like, take a look at U.S. history and how we were taught. It's shocking.
Yeah. So that's kind of what you kind of, I remember you sent it to me. And I started looking through it, and I have to really prep myself for things like that.
I'm sure.
And it's so interesting how when I started reading it and I looked it through, like, wow, this would be really good for white people. So like, look at this video, because just from a baseline understanding, 1619, where do they find it? So you
found it online, which you saw like a web series.
I thought that it's the same concept, but I thought there was two different things.
The Daily, which is like a New York Times, The Daily, which is a podcast, has, and if you go to your podcasts just on your phone and type in 1619, it's like a 4-part series, but it really talks about how every system that we have, from banking to education to healthcare to, it's all, the foundation was all laid on slavery. And so I think that's been important for me and for our organization, because as we go through this, we've talked about roadblocks that you run into and where people get really uncomfortable. The fact of the matter is, Seattle is still really white. And so it's going to require white people to talk to white people about what is going on. And it can't be that every time I have a question, I call you, or one of my other Black or African American friends. And so it's, I think, really important to get that foundation. And so that I thought was what that did a really good job, and you can do it in, like, on your way to work, in the car or in the bus.
Well, can you talk about, just, I think at this point I have one client that's not a white woman leading the nonprofit organization. And are there things that you would say as a white woman to other white women stepping into this work, like some of the things that you can even speak from, like some of the things that you learned, but even if you already knew them, like what are some things that, white women can think about or as they approach this work? Well,
so I think that, in the last few years since the 2016 election, there's been a lot of conversation around women empowerment. But I often think about, like, well, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about white women empowerment? That's unclear. right? When we talk about this global women empowerment movement. And so I think that what I would say to white women and the experience that I've had is we are still at a place of intense privilege, even if our board, our boardship and corporate boards is a fraction of men, or, women in C-suite is a fraction of men. We're still predominantly talking about white women. So I think about as a white woman, this means that I have an opportunity to be an ally. And so, and I think we've talked about it, or a co-conspirator, depending on how feisty I'm feeling that day. But I think that there is something that I feel really in tune with, where I think having come from a socioeconomically, we were not, I came from a poor white family in Eastern Oregon, which some people might call WT. I grew up in I grew up in a trailer, a double wide, but so I'm like, well, okay, so I have my own, I had my own hurdles that I was able to overcome, but also I'm really aware of the fact that I was probably able to do that because of the color of my skin.
Yeah. So do you, maybe this is kind of segueing onto that, but what would you say were some of the most challenging experiences? And then let me see how I word challenging experience, and what has been the most rewarding experiences?
I think challenging, we talked a lot about managing expectations, and I think it's really hard to sit with race being the thing that you really tackle, and reminding, nonprofit world, it is full of a lot of white women who might have other barriers or other isms that in their life, whether it's disability or gender, orientation, sexual orientation. But at the base of it, if we can, I keep telling the team, if we can tackle the hardest thing, if we can tackle race and how we can overcome and find equities there, it's going to be a lot easier to do that in all the other places. And so I think managing the expectations that people have of well, but that's not my experience. I want to deal with my trauma or my oppression now. I don't want to wait, has been one of the biggest challenges. And that level setting, you said it, I've had to be really clear, yes, we will get to that, but right now we're doing this. But I actually think that the most rewarding part of that is that I really think that people get it. I think people are getting it. Well, everyone's on their own. And I think that's the other challenge. Everyone's on their own path on the same journey, which it's rewarding to see people who I thought, oh man, they're never going to come along, or they're so frustrated with this that they might leave the organization, come back to it. And I had someone, a person of color in the organization was like, this isn't happening fast enough. I think I need to leave Fair Start. And I took him for a walk around the block, and I was like, this is not how we're going to do this. There can be a million reasons that you leave Fair Start. This cannot be one of them. Because there's work to do. And so that's been rewarding to see then people come along and then be real champions of the work. And because we're serving really vulnerable populations of people, and the most vulnerable populations of people happen to also be predominantly people of color who really need the work that we're doing. And so getting closer to doing that in a more authentic way is rewarding and challenging, but rewarding.
Well, you mentioned something about when the conversation does switch to other forms of oppression, it's really good. That level setting piece is really important when you walk in the door. And I think we said ad nauseum, we talk about race explicitly, but not exclusively.
Right.
So, we wanted to make clear that, when it comes to forms of oppression, I don't know if we all agree on this, but I think most of us agree that racism is the ultimate other, the ultimate form of oppression that, like you said, if we can kind of deal with that, we can kind of deal with, all the other forms, but not at the exclusion of them, right? It's not about that. So have you found a kind of a sweet spot? Because every organization I've ever worked with has ultimately come to a point where somebody said, well, what about me? What about gender issues? What about abilities? What about, so is there kind of a rhythm that you've gotten to around that, or a place of, this is just what we're going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little of both. I mean, I think we've had to say this is what we're going to do, but we're not excluding. We have, in 2020, we have trainings around our to better, relate to and serve our transgender students and employees, and to have that place of belonging and really feel like their needs are being met. One of the first things that we did, while we were focusing on race was, organization-wide policy around pronouns. And I think that those are really important. We can do those small steps that are really important while doing this big race work, as our key focus. But no, we have trainings that will be peppered in throughout the 2020 calendar that address, that's primarily our other, kind of focus right now, because we do have such a large LGBTQ and transgender community. And so we want to make sure that we're supporting that.
Yeah. Great. So there are people who are walking into this or considering it. I don't know if they'll still consider it after we're done. No, they will.
Do it.
But as they're looking at, what would you tell? So I'm going to ask you two questions. So one is at the ED level. What kind of advice would you give the ED? But also, one of the things that we kind of had to look at too was that middle tier, because that middle tier of management have their, the interaction with so many more people. So their participation and their lens around it, we're like, oh, that's really important. Like, we would need to deal with that middle tier as well. So what advice would you give the ED, and then what advice would you give middle tier management?
I think the advice that I would give the ED is really, like, make sure that your board is really bought in, and spend time on that. And not likely if you have a board that has been, in place for a while, it might be harder for some people. If you have a board with people who have benefited from the wealth around Seattle, this is really sensitive. And so I feel lucky that there were a few really key advocates on my board, and just the board in general was really, really open to this. But I think that that's crucial. I also think that allowing, having some sort of leadership coaching opportunity with like someone like you and Aline were huge resources for me when I was experiencing a leadership challenge that was specifically around race, being able to have that leadership resource. So I think that was a big part of my success in the launch of this. And then I think with the mid-level managers, it's, again, making sure that they see the modeling of, I'm going through this process too, which means that they are going through this. We're all on the journey together. So then it makes it a little bit easier for them to both manage up and manage down, or when it comes to this issue. And I also, one thing that is probably a little unusual about me is I also take meetings with some guardrails up and down the organization. I think that's been really important. Transitioning from, a little bit more hierarchy, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but really when I got a lot of the feedback that I did, that people at the front lines were feeling really excluded from any kind of decision making, as people closest to the work are generally more people of color, I felt it was really important for me to open my doors for that kind of feedback. And I still, 2 weeks ago, had a meeting with a student actually who had some really specific race feedback as it related to the program. And I think that being open to that without it bulldozing and overtaking your life is an important space to make.
Yeah. I have like another question based on what you said. So I'm going to segue and I'm going to come back to this. Okay. So I remember there was a time when we were, so here's what happens, I think, in organizations, and you experienced it firsthand, where we say, okay, we see diversity as a concern, we see, inclusion, like how are the voices counted, we see all these things. And so now we have a position to fill, and we want the best person, obviously, that's going to be able to do this job. And it happened to be a very critical position, right? And so there's this conundrum of, all right, well, if we go out and hire someone that's not a person of color, what are the optics around, oh yeah, right, you said you really wanted to, right? And so we're talking through different ways to share that with staff in a way that really respects what they probably are going to assume or think, but also here's the reality of what we did in this particular role and in Seattle and all of the kind of things that we bump up against. And I've heard a lot of times where, oh, if you wanted to find somebody, you would have, right?
Yeah.
So you hear that you just didn't try hard enough and all these things. And I'm sitting there listening to like, we went to this place, went to that place, we tried this, we tried that. Oftentimes, it's similar to Fair Start, that there hasn't been as a historical engagement with communities where we could just go in and say, oh, we have a position. Hey, who do you have, right? So you're building those relationships. But right now, you have to fill a position. It's a critical position. And there's someone, they're not a person of color. Can you talk about like what, we talked about it, right? But how did you like feel in that process? Did you, once the decision was made, did you, I was there when you told the staff. Can you talk a little bit about how you felt at that time when we were talking it through?
Yeah, so that's where I think transparency is really important. So we did have this role that was a really critical senior leadership role. We went to 2 of the 3 recruiters. Like their responses were just outrageous to me. One wouldn't even take the search if we were determined to have it be a person of color in the role. And then the other firm, it was like, this like crazy near like 6-figure like recruiting fee. And so we went through the best process that we thought we could, that was the most authentic test. And it included, a lot of interviews and panel interviews that were a diverse makeup, both racially and in different parts of the organization. And when we landed on this final candidate, it was a white woman. And so, you and I had the conversation, and it really, I think what it took was explaining to the staff how we ended up where, what was the process. First, we went to the recruiters, then we did this, and really walking them through the process and understanding this seems like an imperfect process. And this is really frustrating as a leader for me, that the outcome that I thought we would arrive upon didn't happen. And that we have this opportunity to create a different process the next time if we're doing the work in the community. So if we're doing our jobs right in this work, then we're eventually, the next time we go to this through this process, hopefully it will be a different slate of candidates. And we now have really, targeted, like we want, half of our slate of candidates to be people of color, and we want at least half of our interview panels to be people of color. And so creating that opportunity. But even when you have a diverse interview panel, they might still pick, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And also there's a lot of allyship it's not like, it's also, nobody wants to be tokenized, right? Like, did I get hired because I deserve this job, or because, oh, they have a quota to fill? And so I never want to be that. But I do think that anyone who comes into our organization, regardless of race or gender, has to be an ally. Like allyship, I think, is super important. And that's like a core requirement, I think.
Getting back to, I have like 4 questions now. Gosh, dog it. Okay, how much time do we have? All right, we got 5 more minutes.
Okay.
We'll do 10. You talked about the board, and what if your board isn't in alignment? What if your board was like lukewarm to the idea, like we're not gonna poo-poo on it, but we're also, you won't see us like being, evangelizing diversity, equity, inclusion in the work of the organization. Do you think that you could have done it without the level of board support you got?
Yeah, I think that it would have looked a little, it's a core our board is there to govern and help set strategic priorities, and DEI is a strategic priority in this next 5-year plan. It's also a core statement in our vision statement, and in our values. I think that there are ways though that you can do it. Like, I think that this idea that, I think about it like, okay, if your board isn't there yet, like it might just take you longer, because I don't think that there is anybody, I'm sure there are some, I could probably think of a lot of people, particularly in the other Washington, who are never going to change their minds on this. But I do think that in the work that we're doing, I think that there's a way, if you give yourself time and you give space for their journey, that it may have taken us longer. but I think that it's a yet. Yeah, I don't think there's any board that, and I also think that there are board members who, frankly, like they might leave, and I still, I don't think that I could foresee any of mine leaving because of this, but I think that there are sometimes if your board doesn't align on something that's important, they'll leave, but I would find it hard to believe that there would be like a majority of a board would be like, no thanks.
Right.
I don't know. That just seems really unlikely.
It does. And some things happen. Okay.
Okay.
But you also, you brought up something. So last time we were together, it was with the board. And so we had this conversation about, speaking of people leaving, what about donors? And so we had this very fun and lively discussion about how far do we go in being explicit about this work if it means donors won't get on board. And so what would you say to leaders who are like, ooh, they're nervous about like their donor base actually buying into this work?
I mean, I think that you have to be okay with the fact that like part of equity is the fact that you may have to sacrifice something to get to a place of equity. And I also think that for every donor who would leave, there's going to be a donor there who will fill that coffer just because they really care about this work. Because this truly, again, in the field that I'm in, this disproportionate, homelessness and poverty disproportionately affects people of color. So if you are someone who really cares about homelessness and poverty, you can't do that only like homelessness and poverty that affects white people. Like that doesn't really work.
Right.
But I do think that that's something that you have to sort of balance. But I also think that there's a way you can do this in a way that's not so like you either agree with us and you're in the circle, or you disagree with us and you're out of the circle. I just think it's nuanced and it takes a little bit more finesse. And I don't know that anyone has to leave. The comment that I got was, I really hope this isn't going to distract you from the mission of Fair Start, which that was a great opportunity to have a conversation about how this is the mission of Fair Start. So that was a really positive.
Well, I think what you're speaking to is so much of what we talked about today, and I just really want to impress upon any leaders of organizations that are listening, so much of what we're talking about today is about the leader having absolute clarity. So I have like a few organizations where the leader did not come to me. It was their either DEI committee or team or a race equity team or something that said, hey, we want to do this work. And so, you find also where you have these committees that are like really excited. I mean, we had the DEI committee at Fair Start again, we had like 40 something people and 50 signed up. And me and Alina were like, okay, we didn't anticipate this level of enthusiasm. And we pat ourselves on the back like, yeah, we really got people inspired. But we're like, oh boy, but it wasn't just us. It was the momentum that people have been looking for. And it was just like this perfect storm. I don't like saying storm, but it's a perfect opportunity for you coming in with that vision, us coming in with, and so how would you share with another leader about how to empower and set your DEI team up for success? And you kind of want to, if you're really about the voices of the people and inclusion part of DEI, how do you set them up for success? But also, you still have a business to run. You still have numbers to do. You still have, people, donors, board that you're beholden to. How did you strike that balance between empowering them to do their thing, but also managing the total organization?
Well, I think that having the level of facilitation when we were doing it was helpful because we're all going through it at the same time. And so having you and Aline help us create some guardrails and help me identify, okay, here are kind of the 5 areas that we think that you should be focused on, and then pushing that out to the teams to get their input. And again, it's all about level setting and going into that DEI work group. I was really clear, like I'm part of the group. There's no hierarchy when we're in this room. And I want to, so empowering the room to do the best work of the organization. But at the end of the day, I'm going to have to prioritize. And if there are some things that just don't align, I'm going to have to make some decisions. But I'm really, what I wanted was, I think any good leader takes surrounds themselves with really diverse perspectives and people who are smarter than them in a lot of ways. And so what I wanted to do was get all of this counsel from across the organization so I could make the best decisions. And was really honest with them as well that some of this is going to be frustrating because it's not going to be prioritized in the way that you want it. And some of it's not going to happen. I mean, there are going to be some things that we can't do it all because the technology doesn't exist to do. I mean, we had some really great ideas, but we did have to go back and have some conversations. Like, I don't think technology exists to where we can do that for a certain HR function. We'll look into it. Or that technology to do that is beyond what our budget. We don't have a budget for that. So how can we rethink it? So it's going back, and it's sort of this in this flow of information, both in and out, to me and the senior leadership team about how we can better the organization. It's really, I think it's worked pretty well. It hasn't been without frustration of some people who are like, well, that's not what I wanted to do in 2020.
Yes.
So, you know, and what do I do? And so we've had to answer some of those questions of like, well, what do I do if what I want to work on isn't a 2020 priority? And then that's a really, you know.
Right.
We don't do it.
Yeah.
Or we do it if we get to, you know, we can get through these other things that we've identified as a group.
Yeah.
That we're going to do.
Great. So 2 more questions. One circling back to the question about advice you would give to middle management, as opposed to the director level leadership. What advice would you give to those middle managers who, I mean, you know, they may not have the same as strong a vision. And so when your vision is not as strong for this work, then it's easier to fall prey to your own instincts or handle things on a case by case basis, or just, you know, your own biases kick in, right? And so do you have any thoughts or notions about how the middle management level is any different than the executive director level?
I mean, the thing that I guess comes to mind for me is that that middle manager may be farther along their journey than maybe the ED is at the time, or there's just insecurity of, you know, they just may have more experience in this work. They may have been through the process before. So if you have a CEO or an ED who's going through this at the first time, you know, for the first time with everyone else, I think there's a little bit of apprehension where you don't know what you're doing. You're kind of wandering in the dark. And so I think that my advice would be, and what I would want is like, be part of the solution. Like, I think it's always, the answer is always, how can you be part of the solution? And I've gone to some middle managers at Fair Start and said, like, okay, here's the deal. Here's the situation that we're in. What are your thoughts on this? And I think that there's a way to reverse engineer into that, where you can have those conversations with the ED or with your, you know, your boss, and say, hey, you know, this is what we're going through. Like, I'd love to share my experience on that.
Unreal. Go ahead. Sorry. I'd love to share your experience. Continue.
So I think that there's a way to go through this and have, again, it's all about that flow of information in and out.
Great. Well, I have one final closing question, and then we will go and see if there's any questions out from the folks. What have you learned about yourself in this process?
I have learned, you know, I think that it's really taught me about the importance. For me, I've learned, I think, more as a parent than I thought that I would, and the importance of this work in my kids' lives. And I think that it's because I am really so much more in tune with my own privilege that I get to do this work and lead this work, and that I'm in a really different scenario, I think, than my 18-year-old self, or, you know, you know, a woman of color who was 18, you know, in the same situation I was in. And so I think that I've learned to appreciate my own privilege, but also I now have a little bit of a fire. So I've now become that parent at school that's like, can we please talk about your curricula on how we're teaching Native American studies in school? Because I'm not sure that's correct. So I've become that annoying teacher, person to the teachers, but it's important. And so I think for me, I've learned that I feel really strongly about this because we all should.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of where allyship starts. It starts from a really like a visceral place.
Yeah.
I think we sometimes want to go in and soothe like this sense of guilt, like I don't know what to do, so I'll be an ally, as opposed to, oh, this is affecting my kids, affecting, like this has a deeper cut to it, and so. Okay, Amy, do you have any other?
I would leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. Omid?
Let me jump in. One reminder, folks, to submit your questions. We have just one so far, but I have two from me that I would love to pose for you all. The first one is thinking of the inevitable conflict that happens on this journey, on this process, and knowing that oftentimes in any organization, for organizational culture reasons, but also for personal reasons, there is a fear of open conflict. And on top of that, a characteristic of white supremacy culture is a fear of open conflict. And all of these things coming to head, I'm wondering, and you all have alluded and spoke about this a little bit, I wonder if we can zero in on what does healthy and constructive conflict look like? Because I think there is often a frame where when we feel the conflict, and you've talked about owning the discomfort, but we think something's going wrong, but it actually is something we need to embrace as well. So I'm wondering, in terms of what conflict looked like, what pushback or tension looked like, if you could just speak a little more to how you're able to leverage that in different ways to just maybe even propel you forward, but to maybe have more moments of clarity collectively in those moments in the spirit of constructive conflict, because that oftentimes can not have a nuance to it when those moments arise. Could you speak a little more to that?
I can take a stab. And
go ahead.
So I think that one of the things that I've gotten out of this is that there are a lot of trainings that are not necessarily DEI specific that are really crucial to have if you're going to do this work well. And so like having hard conversations, how to have hard conversations is sort of a practiced skill, not necessarily something that I think you are automatically good at. I'm not. So that's something that we have been talking about a lot. But I think that it's, we also, one of our values in respect is having, being honest, even when it's difficult. And like, if you think about that as like, I'm going to be really respectful and honest in this difficult conversation, and in return, like that's actually honoring the other person. That's a value that we really intentionally set at Fair Start. And I can think of two examples when one example where we had, I think it was like really early in our journey, and there was just this big conflict. And really what it required was some time and space, and then coming back in a smaller one-on-one, and then maybe a small group setting, but a one-on-one setting. I think that was one way that we dealt with one conflict. And then an avoidance and then there have been other instances of like conflict that appear in the way of avoidance. And that's just, I think, as the leader, you just have to go and be like, I know this is really uncomfortable. It's a little bit like that conversation I referenced with the employee who was going to leave because the DEI work wasn't happening fast enough. I think as a leader, that's the other thing. You can't let everyone know where you are at all times. And so nothing's ever going to happen as fast as I think frontline staff want it to happen. But approaching that avoidance conversation, saying, we need to talk about this before you leave. This is really hard. You can't leave it to your frontline staff to force that conversation. You have to, I think, be the one to approach it. And that I think has worked for me in a couple of instances in this.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing I would add is going back to that whole one, when you start out the gate saying there will be conflict and we're going to normalize it, then when it does happen, you can kind of say, we said there will be conflict, we're going to normalize it. And because, Angela, we had a clear vision, we had a North Star, then we didn't get too derailed by the situation that happened. We were able to always bring it back to the North Star. This is where we're going, and we know there's conflict on the journey to that North Star. And so that kind of, when you set those expectations up front, it kind of makes it a little easier to re-presence them when something does happen. That's my only add.
Awesome. Thank you. And I thought of another question, but maybe it's the same, but I'm just going to throw it in before we go to the Q&A, and this is maybe mostly for Angela. There was a moment in this journey so far where you completely felt like giving up. And if that moment happened, how did you get through it? Because obviously you're here today and talking about all the what has been accomplished. But I want to speak to that realistic grind of it all as well.
Yeah, I mean, I say this with like absolute respect for every employee and coworker I have at Fair Start, but there was a time when, and I think I said this to Michelle, I was like, I don't know that, like, are we like, does everyone want race equity or does everyone want socialism? Like, and I just had this moment where I was just like, I was so confused and like caught in emotion about it and not knowing really what to do, that I was like, I don't know how, like, you just kind of, that's like those throw your hands up in the air moments. And again, I think I just had to give myself space, because we haven't even really followed up on since I had that, moment where I was feeling that way. But then I think that you realize, like, okay, no, that's like not what, like, there may be some people who aren't there yet on the journey to this work, and they're going at a different pace than I want them to go. And I also have to just give people some grace in knowing this is not a 1 or 2 year process. And I've been really clear about that with myself, with like, we're like on the baby journey right now. Like, we're like this far along. And so I think giving myself that grace of like, this is early in our journey, and reminding everyone else the same, that sort of helped me like pick it up of like, okay, well, you don't stop. Like mile 3 of a marathon, for those marathon runners out there, can sometimes be terrible, because you're like, oh my God, I have 23 miles to go. How am I ever going to do it? And you just kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, that's excellent. No, that covers it for me.
Thank you. All right, let's move to Q&A questions. We got a few more that come in. So I'm seeing the one just that came in just most recently. We'll start there. Can you talk about concrete steps you might take in service delivery to center people of color? For example, programmatic shifts, measuring impacts, maybe alliances built, and if you're already working in partnership with POC-led groups, what are some best practices then for a white-led group in thinking about what those concrete steps might be to in service delivery and centering folks of color?
Yeah, so again, it's still being really early in this process. We do have some targeted goals around increasing the number of people of color that we serve, but we also had to take a little bit of a step backward and look at our curricula first. So the last thing that we want to do is start really trying to increase the enrollment of the number of people of color, only to not serve them well because we are not being cultural, like, because we don't have the right cultural sensitivity. So we're kind of really deep in the middle of that work right now. Thinking about, is our curricula at the correct literacy? I mean, when you start breaking down, like, again, this goes back to like the structural, like our systems and education, and the gap that we have with people, particularly Black and African American men and boys, do we have the right curriculum in place? And so one of our, but we also have a really specific strategic goal to engage with and identify and start engaging with 10 different community groups in 2020 to increase just the outreach and learning. Like, I don't think that as Fair Start, we could go out and say, okay, now we want to serve more people of color and take that out to the communities of color, and then be like, great, we've been waiting for you, right? Like, yeah. And so we need to make sure we understand what kind of delivery. And I feel really lucky. Colleen Echohawk, who runs Chief Seattle Club, is a friend of mine, and we've talked about this, and how can we better serve the Native community, and really hearing, I think, what it is that is needed. So I think for us, that's how we're centering, and particularly as a white-led organization, we need to spend some time just understanding the needs that probably are different than the assumptions that we have.
I wanted to, I'm not quite sure what is meant by, and maybe you can help me understand it. And if working in partnership with POC-led groups, what are some best practices for a white-led group? Did you understand that? What was that? Okay. I just needed more clarity about that. But I don't know if we're talking about caucusing or community groups that are white-led, and how to work with them to be allies in centering folks of color in service delivery. So
yeah, I'll just give my take on it. I interpreted it maybe perhaps the way Angela was, in terms of what are the POC-led groups or organizations that you could identify and partner with. So Michelle, maybe it's like all land, without further clarity on the specific question. But I actually had a follow-up on that piece too. Angela, you mentioned identifying those organizations in 2020 and kind of that plan that was developed. For many folks on the webinar, or league organizations and Reggie in general, there's always a lot of conversation about what those relationships, that relationship building and partnership building looks like between an organization, maybe a white-led organization, and any organization really that there's no relationship with. But I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit of that process on how those organizations you identified for 2020 were developed, how you identified them, and at least now, at the stage you're in, the thinking on how to approach them, engage them, and kind of that long-term aspect.
Yeah, so some of this is the benefit of having the DEI work group to come, to do this work, because we have frontline staff who are like, I worked at, I'm just going to pull this out, Atlantic Street Center, and they don't even know about Fair Start, right? And so it's really that personal, I think, going to that relational, a little bit more of that relational centered decision making of, I know somebody in this organization who would benefit from. And so that's part of the way that we're doing it. I think that we're also, for our organization, we're looking at where where populations of color are living. Many of them are in South King County. Who's working in South King County that we know is doing good work and has good outreach and has a real sense of it. And I think that, for me, it is relying on organizations that have leaders, that where leadership is predominantly, people of color in the organization is as well. So we're really doing it kind of from an inside and an outside approach.
Got you. Thank you, Michelle. Anything to add on to that? We have other questions too.
No.
Yeah. Okay. So another question we have, are there any suggestions for how to structure a DEI group / committee, or even how to put a call out for folks to join the DEI group committee at a larger organization, which Fair Start is, but particularly doing all of that when there's a history potentially, or maybe even a culture, spoken or unspoken, of distrust or fear of retaliation that might impede someone from getting involved or joining that group or DEI committee that's being formed.
Well, this is where I feel that leadership buy-in is absolutely critical. By the time it gets to the point where you're putting a call out for people to join a DEI team, the leaders should have already done the work of saying this is happening. They should have made it clear, explicitly clear that we're going to do this work, and put it out in a way where there's an expectation or an invitation, at the very least, for people to come in and join and be a part of the conversation. Another way, when there is historical distrust or, hi, Eileen, when there is distrust or fear of retaliation or something like that, I think that the question becomes, is that a racialized fear? Because sometimes you just have, some leaders just rule by fear, and they create and breed, a lot of fear and anxiety among staff. And so if we're talking about it being racialized, then my approach is to have a caucus group or a discussion group or a sharing circle for folks of color. I want to hear from them what they're afraid of and what the history has been, so that, because as a consultant, I have this opportunity to move between two worlds. I've been in ED before, so I know what it's like to have to account for organizational programmatic stuff, but I also, as a person of color, have been through it, and I also, know how these things play out from my professional experience for folks of color. So are we talking about folks of color, or are we talking about just just in general distrust and fear? So if it is a situation where it's a racialized distrust and fear of retaliation, and I guess I can say this, by virtue of the fact that, there's concern about joining a DEI group, it is racialized. I guess that just makes it racialized, period. But I think that the leadership, has to kind of shepherd that process. And there also takes, this piece of really being honest and transparent about the leader has to own up and acknowledge the historical things that have happened in the organization to even start the conversation of moving forward. And I think that doesn't happen a lot. I think that the leader is not willing, able, or something to have a conversation that says, hey, before we even talk about moving into this anti-racist conversation or, diversity, equity, inclusion, let's acknowledge what you've experienced. Let's acknowledge what this organization has been historically, so we can kind of heal that and then move forward. But I don't even think there's room or often opportunity given for staff to be able to even unpack what's happened, but they're expected to move into this work. And I think that's problematic as well. So I think that's a long-winded way to answer that question.
No, thank you. We have another question. There was mention earlier, I can't remember if it was you, who spoke it, but there was mention that earlier on, frontline staff and maybe students feeling like they did not have maybe input in the decision-making process. And the question is, how did the race equity process that was put in place impact or change the way that staff engage with the leadership across, the inherent hierarchy? And if there were any changes to specific processes or practices around decision-making, beyond maybe attending more meetings, which the person who asked the question acknowledges a good example, but beyond, attending more meetings, if there were any changes to how that decision-making process was done.
Yeah, so I would say we're still work in progress. That is one of our other 5 kind of pillars, is how we impact decision-making processes. But going through our overarching strategic plan around the same time as going through this was actually a great opportunity for us to try some of this out. So we really sought a lot of feedback from staff and students and volunteers, actually, around the words that we were going to put in our mission statement, what we were going to put in our vision statement, and how we were going to define our values. And for Fair Start, that looked like big poster boards around the organization, requesting words that came to mind when they thought about the Fair Start values. It also took, again, a little bit of vulnerability and a breakdown of this punitive culture by saying, here are 4 options for a mission statement. Give your feedback. And some of the feedback was not gentle, but it was really, I think it was really cathartic for those who needed to express it. But I also think that at the same time, no one got in trouble, and it has allowed for some opportunities for people to feel like, okay, I could have said that in a nicer way, but at least my voice was heard. And so that seems like such maybe a small thing, but for Fair Start, it was a really huge process to bring people along in every step of the way. And I think that part of it was, again, it's that communication. This is also a lot of just change management, right? It's just a constant process of change management, just in a really sensitive way. And so lots of communication and lots of opportunity for input.
Awesome. All right, we have one more question. If folks have any others for either Angela and Michelle, please send them in. This question I'll read, and then I'll add my take to it as well. The question is, I think this was mentioning of the hiring process y'all were alluding to before, where the comment was the applicant at the end was a white woman, and kind of the decision and thinking at that moment. So the question was, if there was an arduous process that was put into place and the process didn't result in hiring someone of color, would you agree that the process in place was ineffective? And when I read this question, I think about those moments of learning, the iterative process, the correction, and also, it's just a constant work in progress as well. So in this case, we have our goals in the hiring process. We have the values and things we want to incorporate into the process. But maybe in this case, an unexpected result, given the goal that were set DEI-wise in the hiring piece. So wondering if one or both of you could speak to this question, but also a little bit of what I added about the iterative process as well, but maybe in relation to this one instance of the hiring story that y'all shared.
So Michelle and Aline know, this was a real, I was like, we like right out of the gates failed. Mm-hmm. And it was, again, that moment to be like, okay, wait, we're buying into our own white supremacy culture by saying, like, by really labeling this as a failure. And I think, to your point, that iterative process of, we are so early in our journey, and not only are we early in our journey, like, we were just launching the journey. Well, we hadn't even finished our DEI strategic plan when this was going into place. And I think it's hard because there is, I think that it would be fair to say a goal for myself is to eventually replace myself with a person of color in my role, right? Like, I think that we need to be working toward those things. And that really, from what I learned in this, was not necessarily that the process was broken or ineffective, was just that it's a continuum, and we were at an early place in the process. And frankly, Seattle is in an early place in this process of bringing women, women and women of color and men of, like, just people of color into leadership positions, and growing people into that executive space is something that requires a commitment from the nonprofit space, the for-profit space. I will just add that I was at a conference last week around, it was specifically around women on corporate boards. And I sat there the entire time thinking, how in the world are, like, women of color going to make it onto corporate boards if we won't even put women of color into the C-suite? And so I think that really this is how, and so we need to do this as well. And this is part of our process. And I think that, again, try not to beat ourselves up too much because we didn't do it perfectly this time. But also just realizing that there's a whole system of growth that needs to happen to make that process effective, if effective is something it can be.
Yeah, I would to piggyback on that. I think for me, one of the most important things in that process was that we went to the staff and had a conversation with them about where we are. Like, look, y'all, this is where we are. We didn't hide anything or try to step over what was happening. And actually, we decided at that meeting to say, okay, so let's use this as an opportunity. Like, who do we need to be, and what do we need to do so that the next time this happens, we actually have a community of resources and people and candidates that we can just go into and tap into. We have not done a good job historically of establishing those relationships, and this is where we are as a result of that. So it's an opportunity to kind of acknowledge where we had missed some steps before and the areas that we need to grow in. And, I always say as a consultant, yes, absolutely. We want, for me, the name of the game is to have a diverse pool of applicants. That doesn't mean that you're going to pick necessarily a person of color. It means we had a pool of qualified candidates who showed up to the table, and we looked we had a diverse team to examine the different resumes, and then we had a diverse team to interview them and check us for our implicit biases. We had a selection process that was transparent, where we are very clear why we handled this person. And at that point, whoever we land with was done with due diligence and collaboration, and in the spirit of diversity, like wanting the best person for our team. And so I think that I just kind of caution us against, if it worked, that means there's a person of color in there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to caution us against just getting into that loop. And if there's not a person of color, it didn't work. Now, there were the things, the barriers, right? But we've acknowledged them. And so I tend to go to the process and the spirit of what happened to land to that decision, and who we are now that is different than before, such that we can deal with what happened in the process.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that was actually it was around that time that we also decided that we were going to be hiring a VP. So we have had an interim VP of HR, and we made a decision, a really intentional decision at that point, to hire, when it was time to replace our interim, that we would do it with a VP of HR and DEI. And so we want that experience in our HR department. That job is still open, just shameless plug.
Nice. So a follow-up question on that, and this might be something that you all already touched on, but Angela, earlier you commented on maybe one of the first meetings you attended, the body language of folks in the room, arms folded. And so the question was, what do you think were the specific things, or what were the specific things that you did to really change that, to really get the arms unfolded, if you will?
I think it was kind of just calling it out. Like, I mean, we really did. We were like, what is going on with, and we called it out after the fact. We were like, so what was the deal with the room that we were in last week, and why, like, what was going on with people? And it was interesting to hear almost from everyone, regardless of race. Like, I was worried I was going to offend someone else in the room. And it was interesting because I found that the white people in the room thought they were like, not only did they think that they were going to offend the people of color in the room, they were really offended that they were worried they were going to offend the other white people in the room. And so it was this fear of like, I don't want to be like the person who says the wrong thing. And when we just acknowledged that and brought people to the space of like, well, you're going to, and I'm going, and I mean, I'm sure you guys may get some fear. I might have said the wrong thing today. I have no idea. But like, just going through this process, like, you're going to say the wrong things, and it's not going to land well. And it's giving people the grace to understand and to rethink and to, and just give, like, you got to give people a break. And I mean, if we're going to hold everyone to perfection through this process, like, it's going to be impossible.
Yeah, I think one of the things that both Lena and I picked up on early is that when you do this work, you have your folks, and these are usually, we say the woke Olympics, and it's usually by white folks who like they tone policing and don't say that, and here's the correct thing, and everybody wants to show up to the work saying the right and looking more fluent and looking, all these things kind of happen, and we were kind of sorting that out in the beginning. But even at that first meeting that you were mentioning where people were folded, Angela actually said something that was very vulnerable, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something that was away from as a leader, I'm going to give this very, technical answer, and I'm going to be really smart. She says, I just don't feel, either you use the word feeling or what's going on in this room. I think you raised it up, and I don't know, Yolene's nodding her head. Yeah, but there was something, we looked at each other like, oh, we have something here. So great, because we have a leader that is willing to speak to it in a vulnerable way. And so I think that's also part of what that shift was, Omid, is that, as a leader, you have to model the way, right? And so, that was one thing that I believe went a long way in bringing people to a place where they're not as, and we called out things like the punitive culture. We called out things. So again, going back to that, we need to acknowledge what it is and what's happening now, so that we can at least tell people we know it and we see it, and it is our intention to address it. And
Yeah, and I will say, the one thing that I will say that was a big impact. So I think that as to the other EDs on the call, if there are people in your team who are just not like, not only are they not going to be in line with this work, but they're just not good for your organization, because they're never like, I think there are some people that just, they're not going to get there and they're not going to be able to lead through this. I think it's worth the conversation about whether or not they should be in the organization. Like, I think there was some of the work that like we had to acknowledge that like, this is probably not going to be accomplished with certain dynamics. And that's, I think that is part of it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, final question from me to each of you. Michelle, kind of related to what you last touched on. From in your role, doing the consulting work you do, generally speaking, what do you wish or would like from every positional authority leader that you're working with in terms of working with them to advance this work? What do you wish each positional authority person you're working with has or can do for you to be able to do your job well? And you kind of spoke to it maybe in terms of Angela's role, and you can certainly use that as well. But this is something for anyone in a positional authority position to be thinking about. This is what it will take from me to maybe bring an external consultant and work with them well. And then Angela, my question for you is, what is something you know today that you wish you knew on day one?
Okay, you go first. Give me some time to think about that.
Okay. So some of the things that I wish leaders would do, or I'll frame it in not do. Don't say I am, blessing this DEI team, or, I'm into this work and I'm blessing this team to lead and shepherd this work, and then not be collaborative, right? And operating in good faith and collaborative and those kind of things. Because it brings more harm, because a lot of times the DEI groups are made up of folks of color who have taken the risk to put themselves out here again to try to advance this work. And then when you do that and they actually operate in good faith, and then they feel that that good faith is not honored, that's very damaging. And it does a number on employee morale. The second thing is, I didn't get a chance to ask Angela this, but it's around resources. You put your money where your values are, right? And so one of the things that I see is that, oh, we don't have money for this, we don't have money for that. No, you have to consult, or you have to allocate resources for people to take time from their schedules to do this work, or to allow for different things that need to happen to build community and build relationships and build this work in the organization. And finally, I would recommend, and this is really not a shameless plug, it's not, but I would recommend that there's some kind of consultant or outsider to help you think it through. And especially, this is for if you're a person of color or if you're a white person, but in particular, if you're a white person, you really want somebody to help you see those areas that you just can't see. Because one of the things that really kind of move this work around or can harm it is not necessarily always like what is actually happening, but the optics of what's happening. And so an outsider can help you kind of see those optics, and we're like, yeah, well, if you do this, then it's going to appear like, and they're like, but that's not even the intention. Oh, I got it. If you do this, that could have these kind of optics, and being able to see. And also, if you're a white person leading this work, by virtue of being white, there's just some things that you won't see. And I think it's okay to say, can I get some air cover on some things that I'm not seeing? But be willing to take the coaching, and you ask, and then something's presented. And so I think from a leadership standpoint, those are the three things that I would raise up.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, and then the question was, what do I wish I had known? What do
you know today that you wish you had known on day one when you started on this work? Former you wish former you knew.
Yeah, I wish the former me knew. I was truly going through this. I'm a little bit of maybe a unique situation, because I was going through this as real time of not knowing the organization. So like, again, this work started like day one of DEI work was like day one of my, work leadership at Fair Start. So in some ways I wish that, in some ways I think it was a real benefit, because I got to know the real raw, part of Fair Start from the beginning. But at the same time, it can be really consuming. Like, this work can be all consuming. And so I think for me, if anything, I wish I had a little bit of a better lay of the land, so that I could help navigate a little bit, you know, things that were going on aside from DEI. I don't know that I would change it necessarily, because I think that it really happened in the way that it needed to, but I could see some benefit. And I wouldn't suggest being like, no, I need to, I'm new in my role, I need to wait 6 months. Like, I don't think I would recommend that either. I think it's just hindsight would have been nice.
Yeah.
Got you. Yeah. Well, thank you both for your time today. Really enjoy both of you being here with us and with everyone on the webinar. If you want to get in touch, it sounds like there's an HR position open at Fair Start, fairstart.org. Michelle, majorsleadership.org. We're going to send a follow-up with folks. Anyone who's registered will get a link to watch this back on demand, and different ways to stay in touch on the Reggie website as well, wareji.org. We'll be sure to send out all these links and other resources mentioned, so they're handy for everyone. And just my own PSA, you know, doing this organizational institutional work is difficult. It is slow moving. There are countless ups and downs. And I want to always plug that wherever we can do and practice anti-racism in our lives is going to be meaningful. And so my specific PCA is how you spend your money, POC-led groups and organizations. That is, you know, practicing bringing and shifting resources to communities of color, Black, Indigenous communities of color. So just thinking of ways to get involved, connected outside of your organization while you're continuing to do the good work and experiencing those ups and downs within your organization. So with that, thank you all for being on the webinar. Thank you, Angela and Michelle. Thank you for everyone for sending their questions. And we will send a follow-up with all the links folks are asking for, including the link of this webinar you can share with others, but all that will be in that follow-up. So thank you both. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Bye.